Chihuahua, October 2010. A town needed a police chief. Every man they asked said no. A 38-year-old lawyer took the job, refused bodyguards, and drove to work alone. She lasted 7 weeks. She is the first of 10 women who stood in front of a cartel with nothing and paid for it. Section 1. Hermila Garcia Quiñones. Hermila Garcia Quiñones was 38 years old and had trained as a lawyer. She was single and had no children. She was from the area. She went on to police, and on October 9, 2010, she was sworn in as chief of the municipal force in Meoqui, a farming town in central Chihuahua, about 43 miles south of the state capital. The force she took over had roughly 90 officers. Meoqui sits in the Delicias Valley, an irrigated agricultural district along the Conchos River that grows cotton, alfalfa, chile, and pecans, and it is the kind of place where the police work had historically meant traffic, domestic disputes, and the occasional theft from a field. For most of its recorded history, the town produced a handful of killings a year. In 2010, it recorded around 40. That figure was described at the time as roughly what the town would normally accumulate across 7 years. The reason had nothing to do with Meoqui. Chihuahua in 2010 was the center of the worst violence in Mexico, and the source of it was a war over Ciudad Juárez, 200 miles to the north. The Juárez cartel, run by the Carrillo Fuentes family, had held the crossing at Juárez for decades. In 2008, the Sinaloa cartel moved to take it. What followed ran for years and killed thousands of people, and it did not stay inside the city. The Juárez organization fought through an armed wing called La Línea, made up substantially of serving and former Chihuahua state and municipal police officers, and both sides pushed outward into the smaller towns along the highways that fed the border. Small municipalities that had never mattered strategically suddenly mattered because they sat on roads, held storage, and had police departments small enough to buy. That last point is the one that explains why the chief's job in Meoqui was open. Mexican policing is divided across 3 levels, and the municipal level is the weakest of the 3 by a wide margin. A town force is funded from a municipal budget, which in a place the size of Meoqui is small. Officers are paid poorly, trained briefly, and equipped with whatever the town can afford. They live in the community they police, which means their families are locally addressable, and they are commanded by a chief appointed by the mayor rather than by any state or federal authority. For a criminal organization trying to control a road, a force built that way is not an obstacle, it is a resource. The standard approach across northern Mexico in those years was to buy the department, and where that failed, to kill the person at the top of it and buy the replacement. By the autumn of 2010, that approach had produced a specific and visible problem across Chihuahua. Police chiefs were being killed at a rate that made the position unfillable. Towns were advertising and getting no applicants. In some municipalities, the job sat vacant for months, while the department ran without a commander. In one Chihuahua town, Praxedis G. Guerrero, in the Juárez Valley, the previous chief's severed head had been left outside the police station, and afterward, nobody would take the post. The scale of that problem is easy to state and hard to absorb. Chihuahua recorded thousands of homicides in 2010, the worst year in the state's history, and a disproportionate share of the victims wearing a uniform were commanders rather than patrol officers. Killing a patrolman changes nothing. Killing the chief vacates the only position in a municipal department that decides which cases get worked, which roads get patrolled, and which vehicles get waved through. Across northern Mexico in that period, the chief's office was treated as the actual target, and the appointment process that filled it became, in practice, a negotiation nobody admitted was happening. In October 2010, the same month Garcia was sworn in at Meoqui, Praxedis filled its vacancy with a 20-year-old criminology student and mother named Marisol Valles Garcia. International coverage called her the bravest woman in Mexico. The two appointments happened weeks apart, in the same state, for the same reason, which was that the men who would ordinarily have taken those jobs had looked at what the jobs now involved and declined. The comparison between the two is worth following to its end because one of them lived. Valles Garcia ran a policing program in Praxedis G. Guerrero, built around prevention rather than confrontation, with a force that was mostly women and mostly unarmed, on the reasoning that a department which did not attempt to interdict anything would not be worth killing. That reasoning held for a few months. By March 2011, she had received direct threats, and she left Praxedis, crossed into Texas, and applied for asylum, which was granted. The lesson available from the two cases side by side is not that one woman was braver than the other. It is that in Chihuahua in 2010, the only two outcomes on offer for a woman running a municipal police force were leaving the country or being shot on the way to work. Garcia had looked at the same thing and reached the opposite conclusion. She was known locally as La Jefa. She turned down bodyguards. Accounts published at the time reported that she also declined to carry a weapon and quoted her explanation, which was that a person who owes nothing has nothing to fear. That account appeared widely in international coverage. A competing account circulated afterward in local commentary from someone identifying as a relative, saying she did carry a firearm and reached for it when her car was blocked. No official statement from the Chihuahua Attorney General's office resolves the point, and it should be read as unsettled. What is not in dispute is that she drove herself. She had no escort vehicle, no detail, and no armored car, and her route from her home to the municipal building was the same route every morning. On the morning of Monday, November 29, 2010, she left her house and was intercepted roughly 5 minutes later near a settlement called Los Garcia. Reporting sourced to Mexican press accounts described two men getting out of a Volkswagen Jetta and firing at least 3 shots into her vehicle. Other accounts described a convoy of gunmen. She was killed at the scene. Photographs distributed afterward show her car stopped on an ordinary 2-lane road and a covered body beside it. She had been chief for 7 weeks. The Chihuahua State Attorney General's office confirmed the killing the same day and attributed it to organized crime. No motive more specific than that was ever made public. No arrest in the case has been publicly announced. No suspect has been named. There is no record of any prosecution. What an investigation into that killing would have required is worth setting out, because it explains why there was not one. The murder of a municipal police chief in Chihuahua falls to the State Attorney General's office, since municipal forces do not investigate homicides, and the federal government takes a case only where a federal offense is established. The Chihuahua state prosecutors working in November 2010 were carrying a caseload of thousands of open homicides across the state, in an office that had itself been the subject of repeated findings of infiltration, investigating a killing in which the likely killers were connected to an organization that had a documented presence inside the state police. Every structural condition needed to bury the case was already in place before anyone opened a file. The context in which the news landed says something about the period. On the same day Garcia was killed, Mexican soldiers working in a different part of the state found 18 bodies buried on a ranch near the Texas border. Both items ran in the same wire dispatches. In Chihuahua, in late 2010, the murder of a municipal police chief and the discovery of a mass grave were competing for space in the same day's coverage, and neither one displaced the other. The question of what she had actually done to be killed has never been answered, and the honest position is that it may not require an answer. She had not run an operation. She had not made arrests that threatened anyone. She had been in the job under 2 months, which is not enough time to build a case against anything. What she had done was take a position that the organizations operating in that district expected to fill themselves, and refuse the arrangement that came with it. In a system where control of a municipal force is bought, an uncorrupted chief is a problem on the first day, before doing anything at all. That is the pattern the following years bore out across the state. Chihuahua's municipal departments were purged, rebuilt, purged again, and eventually consolidated on the finding that individual town forces could not be kept clean. Officers were dismissed in batches, whole departments were stood down. The state moved toward unified command precisely because the model Garcia had inherited. A small, locally funded force commanded by a locally appointed chief had proven impossible to defend from the inside. There is one more thing the case establishes, and it applies to most of what follows in this video. The absence of a prosecution is not evidence that nobody knows what happened. In a town of that size, a killing carried out in daylight on a road everyone uses by people who had to know her route and her schedule is not anonymous to the community it happened in. What is missing is not information. What is missing is any institution with both the capacity and the independence to act on it. And in Chihuahua, in 2010, there was none. Meoki appointed a new chief. The town is still there, and it still grows chile and pecans, and the violence that arrived from the north eventually receded from it the way it receded from a great many towns in that valley, without anyone ever explaining why it had come. Jamila Garcia Quiñones appears in the Chihuahua homicide figures for 2010, in a year in which the state recorded thousands of them. She has a grave. There is no case file that has produced a name, a charge, or a hearing in the 15 years since, and there is no indication that anyone is still working it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 17 days later, in the same state, another woman was standing outside the governor's palace in Chihuahua City. She had spent 2 years doing the police work that the police would not do, and she had already found her daughter's killer herself. The men who came for her arrived in a car, and the whole thing was recorded by a security camera. Section 2. Maricela Escobedo Ortiz. Maricela Escobedo Ortiz was 52 years old. She had been born in Piedras Negras, on the Coahuila side of the border with Texas, and she had worked as a nurse and later run a market stall. She lived in Ciudad Juarez. She had 5 children. Until August 2008, there was nothing in her life that would have put her in front of a television camera. That month, her 16-year-old daughter, Ruby Marisol Freire Escobedo, disappeared in Ciudad Juarez. Ruby had been living with her partner, a man named Sergio Rafael Barraza Bocanegra. The family reported her missing. What happened over the following 10 months is the reason the case is remembered, and it is worth setting out carefully, because almost every part of the investigation was carried out by the mother rather than by the state. Juarez in 2008 was the most violent city in the world, and the disappearance of a teenage girl there did not generate an investigation, it generated a file. The city had by then spent 15 years as the international shorthand for exactly this. After a long series of killings and disappearances of young women beginning in the early 1990s that Mexican and international bodies had documented at length, and that Mexican authorities had never satisfactorily resolved. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled against Mexico on that pattern in 2009, in a judgment concerning 3 young women found in a Juarez cotton field, and found that the state had failed in its duty to investigate. Ruby Freire disappeared into the middle of that record. What made Ruby's case different from thousands of others in that city was that the family knew, immediately and without needing an investigation to tell them, who they were looking for. She had been living with Barraza. He was not a stranger who had taken a girl off a street. He was known to the family. His relatives were known to the family, and when Ruby stopped answering and he left Juarez, the sequence was not difficult to read. What the family did not have was any mechanism to act on it. Reporting a suspect by name to a Juarez prosecutor's office in 2008 placed a piece of paper into a system that was, in that year, receiving several thousand homicides and an unknown number of disappearances, and that had no functioning capacity to pursue any but a fraction of them. Her mother did the work herself. She established where Barraza had gone, which was the state of Zacatecas, and she pushed until he was located and detained. Ruby's remains were recovered in June 2009, nearly a year after she vanished. Accounts of the recovery differ in an important way. Some reporting describes the remains as burned and dismembered and dumped at a pig ranch outside the city. Other reporting, including Associated Press coverage at the time, describes them as found in a trash container in Juarez on June 18, 2009. The two versions have never been reconciled in any published account, and both continue to circulate. Barraza was tried. During the oral proceedings, he confessed. He described what he had done, identified the location where he had disposed of the body, and asked for forgiveness, and he did all of it in the courtroom with Ruby's mother present. On April 29, 2010, a panel of 3 judges acquitted him for lack of evidence. They are named in the human rights complaints filed afterward as Catalina Ochoa Contreras, Netzahualcoyotl Zúñiga Vázquez, and Rafael Budib Jurado. He walked out of custody. The mechanics of that acquittal are the part most people find impossible, and they are explainable. Chihuahua had been among the first Mexican states to move to an accusatorial trial system, ahead of the national reform that followed. Under that system, a confession obtained outside the courtroom carries far less weight than it had under the old written procedure, and the prosecution has to prove its case in open court through evidence subjected to challenge. The Chihuahua prosecution had built its case around the confession and had not assembled much else. The judges found the evidence insufficient. An appeals court overturned that decision roughly a month later and sentenced Barraza to 50 years. By then, he was already gone, and no arrest warrant reached him. That is the point at which Maricela Escobedo stopped being a grieving mother and became something the Chihuahua government could not manage. She protested continuously and in public. She walked from Ciudad Juarez to Chihuahua City to demand action from the state governor. In July 2010, she moved her protest to the Alameda Central in Mexico City and directed it at the president. In September, she went to a national feminist gathering in Zacatecas to press for a search there, because that was where she had reason to believe Barraza was. She told a Juarez newspaper that after the acquittal, Barraza's family had threatened her and that she believed he had joined Los Zetas. On November 25, 2010, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, she took part in a demonstration outside the government palace in Chihuahua City with a group called Justice for Our Daughters. The women hung the names of more than 300 women killed in the state that year on a monument outside the building. After that demonstration ended, Escobedo did not leave. She set up a permanent vigil at the same spot and said publicly that she was prepared to spend Christmas and New Year there. Accounts of how long that vigil ran before she was killed differ, from 3 days to 8 days, depending on whether the count begins at the November demonstration or at a later point. What the accounts agree on is that she was there in the open, in front of the seat of the state government, for an extended period, and that everyone in Chihuahua politics knew she was there. The vigil itself is worth picturing accurately, because the geography of it matters. The government palace in Chihuahua City is a colonial building on the main square, and the plaza in front of it is a public space with vehicle traffic on the surrounding streets. There is no perimeter, no setback, and no controlled approach. A person maintaining a protest there is standing on an open sidewalk within a few steps of a road, in front of a building with state police stationed at it. Escobedo had a tent and a folding chair, and the names of dead women hung on a monument. She was, by design, impossible to ignore and impossible to protect, and she had already told a newspaper that the family of the man she was pursuing had threatened her. Whether the state offered her protection during those weeks, and whether she refused it, is not clearly established in the published record. What is established is that she was killed in front of the building she had been protesting against, with police present in the vicinity, and that nobody intervened. On the evening of December 16, 2010, a car pulled up, Security cameras covering the plaza recorded what followed. The vehicle carried several men, at least one of them masked. One got out and approached her. There was a brief exchange. She turned and ran toward the doors of the government palace. He followed her across the street and shot her in the head at the entrance. He returned to the car and it left. She was taken to a hospital and died within minutes. She was 52. The footage was broadcast. That is the specific reason this killing occupies the place it does in Mexican public memory. And it is worth stating plainly what the footage shows, which is a woman being chased down and executed at the front door of a state government building on a lit street in a provincial capital with the seat of the governor directly behind her. Nothing about it required an investigation to establish, because the whole thing was on video within hours. What followed was not an investigation so much as a continuation. Within about a week, Manuel Monge Amparan, the brother of Escobedo's partner, was murdered in Ciudad Juarez and his body dumped in the street. The family business was burned to the ground. Surviving members of the family left the state. In March 2011, a witness connected to the case was killed. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued a formal condemnation and pointed at the pattern rather than the single incident. Sergio Rafael Barraza Bocanegra was never tried for her death. He was suspected of having ordered it, and he was killed in 2012 during a clash with the Mexican military. The 50-year sentence handed down for Ruby's murder was never served. Two things came out of the case that outlasted everyone involved in it. The first is legal and institutional. The acquittal became a permanent reference point in Mexican arguments about the accusatorial system, cited by people who believed the reform had been implemented without the investigative capacity to support it. And the conduct of the three judges was the subject of formal complaints. The second is cultural. In 2020, Netflix released a documentary series about the case, built substantially around the surviving footage and the family's own recordings, and it introduced the case to an audience that had never heard of Ciudad Juarez in 2008. There is a third thing, harder to measure, which is the effect the case had on the women who came after her. The search collectives that spread across Mexico over the following decade, groups of mothers digging in fields for their own children because nobody else would, were already forming when Escobedo was killed. Her case gave them a template and a warning at the same time. The template was that a family with no resources and no training could locate a suspect the state could not locate. The warning was what happened to the woman who did it and then stood in public and said so. Both halves of that lesson have been repeated in the years since, in Sinaloa, in Veracruz, in Tamaulipas, and in Chihuahua itself. None of those brought a prosecution. Nobody has been convicted of killing Marisela Escobedo Ortiz. The man who pulled the trigger outside the government palace has never been publicly identified. What she had done, in the terms this video is concerned with, was refuse to accept an outcome. She had located a suspect the state could not locate, produced a confession the state could not produce, lost the case anyway, and then made herself permanently visible in front of the building responsible for it. She was not an activist by training or by inclination. She became one because there was no alternative available to her, and the thing she was killed for was declining to stop. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 9 months later, and 400 miles east, a newspaper editor in Nuevo Laredo was writing about the cartels under a name nobody was supposed to be able to trace. On a Saturday morning, her body was found arranged with a keyboard and a set of headphones, and the note left with her named the website she had been posting to. Section 3. Maria Elizabeth Macias Castro. Maria Elizabeth Macias Castro was 39 years old and worked at a newspaper in Nuevo Laredo called Primera Hora, where she held the news editor's post and handled a mix of reporting and administrative work. She had previously worked at El Mañana, one of the older papers in the city. By the standards of the profession, she was not a national figure. She was a local editor in a border town, and the paper she edited had not published anything substantial about crime in years. There is a discrepancy in her name that runs through the coverage of her death and has never been cleaned up. International press freedom organizations, including the Committee to Protect Journalists and the International Press Institute, recorded her as Maria Elizabeth Macias Castro. Some Mexican and English language reporting recorded her as Marisol Macias Castañeda. Both names refer to the same woman and the same killing. The confusion originated in the first hours after her body was found and was never corrected in a way that reached every outlet. Nuevo Laredo sits directly across the Rio Grande from Laredo, Texas, at what is by volume the most important commercial land crossing between the two countries. More trade moves through that gap than any other point on the border. The value of controlling it is the reason the city has spent the better part of 2 decades as a battlefield, and the reason the local press stopped functioning long before Macias Castro was killed. The mechanics of how that press was shut down are documented and specific. In 2004, the editorial director of El Mañana, Roberto Javier Mora Garcia, was murdered. In 2006, the same newspaper's offices were attacked with a grenade and gunfire, and a reporter was left permanently disabled. Neither case produced accountability that changed anything. What followed across Tamaulipas was not a formal censorship regime, but something that worked better than one. Newspapers were given to understand which subjects were closed. Reporters received instructions by telephone about what would and would not run. Editors who tested the boundary found out quickly where it was. By 2011, the arrangement had settled into a state where a gun battle could take place on a main avenue in Nuevo Laredo in the afternoon and appear in no newspaper the following morning. That vacuum is what produced the thing Macias Castro died for. When the newspapers stopped reporting, residents of the border cities began reporting to each other. They used Twitter, Facebook, and a set of locally built websites, and the most established of those in Nuevo Laredo was called Nuevo Laredo en Vivo. It functioned as a warning system. Users posted the locations of shootouts, roadblocks, checkpoints, and armed groups so that other people could avoid them, and the site also carried a channel through which residents could report criminal activity anonymously to the authorities. It was operated by people using pseudonyms for obvious reasons. The way that reporting worked in practice is worth describing, because it was more disciplined than the phrase citizen journalism suggests. Someone hearing gunfire would post the intersection, someone else nearby would confirm or correct it. A third person would report which direction the vehicles had gone. Within a few minutes, a picture would assemble itself out of a dozen partial observations, and people across the city would adjust their routes accordingly. Parents used it to decide whether to collect children from school. Drivers used it to decide which bridge to take. It was a functioning public safety system, operated entirely by volunteers under false names, and it existed because the institutions that were supposed to provide one had either failed or been bought. Macias Castro was one of them. She posted under the name La Nena de Laredo, the girl from Laredo, using the handle Nena de Laredo, and she moderated forums on Nuevo Laredo en Vivo. She was, by the accounts of people who used the site, among its most active participants. She wrote about criminal groups and about petty corruption and mismanagement in city affairs, which is to say, she wrote in her own time and under a false name about exactly the subjects her newspaper had stopped covering. By September 2011, the organizations operating in Nuevo Laredo had decided that this was a problem worth solving publicly. On September 13, 11 days before she was killed, the bodies of 2 young people were hung from a pedestrian overpass in the city. Notes left with them warned against posting on websites. Neither of the 2 has been publicly identified as a journalist. The message was directed at the general population of people using the internet to report what the newspapers would not. The value of the Nuevo Laredo crossing explains why the organizations there were prepared to invest in that kind of demonstration. More commercial freight enters the United States through Laredo than through any other port of entry on the southern border, by a wide margin. Tens of thousands of trucks cross every week. An organization that controls what goes onto those trucks controls the single most valuable smuggling channel in the hemisphere. And by 2011, that control was being contested violently, because the Zetas had broken from the Gulf Cartel the previous year, and the two were fighting through Tamaulipas for exactly this. In a contest of that value, a website that tells people where your vehicles are is not a nuisance. It is a surveillance network run against those organizations by the general public. Macias Castro was abducted on Friday, September 23, 2011. Her body was found the following morning. Accounts of where it was found differ. Some describe a roadside near the city. Others, including the International Press Institute, place it in a town square near a monument to Christopher Columbus. What every account agrees on is the arrangement. She had been decapitated, and her head was placed beside the body, along with a keyboard, headphones, cables, and a CD player. A note was left with her. It referred directly to Nuevo Laredo en Vivo, used her pseudonym, and stated that what had happened to her was the result of her reporting and the reporting of others like her. It was signed with the letter Z, the marker used by Los Zetas. The Tamaulipas State Attorney General's office identified her on the Saturday evening and stated that it would investigate. The newspapers in Tamaulipas, including her own, published nothing about it. Coverage of her murder came from Mexico City and from outside the country. Universal reported on the self-censorship that followed, noting that it extended beyond the regional media to local non-governmental organizations, which also declined to comment and cited safety as the reason. Journalists across the region began deleting their social media accounts. The Committee to Protect Journalists classified the case as the first murder it had ever documented anywhere in the world committed in direct relation to journalism published on social media. That designation matters less as a milestone than as a description of what had been established. Until that point, the working assumption among people posting anonymously about cartel activity was that anonymity was itself a form of protection. The note left with her body was written to destroy that assumption, and it named her pseudonym specifically in order to do it. How her identity was discovered has never been established. Colleagues raised the possibility that a phone or an account had been compromised, which would have exposed not only her, but everyone who had communicated with her. That concern is the reason a substantial number of citizen reporting accounts in Tamaulipas went silent in the weeks that followed, rather than simply becoming more careful. There is a further point about the note that is easy to miss. It did not simply claim the killing. It addressed a website by name and told its users that what had happened to her was the consequence of her reporting and of theirs. The second half of that sentence is the operative one. The people it was written for were not the readers of any newspaper. They were the several thousand residents of a border city who had been quietly typing intersections into a forum, most of whom had never considered themselves journalists, and none of whom had any protection of any kind. The note told them that the distinction between a reporter and a person posting a warning had been abolished. Reporters Without Borders recorded 4 netizens murdered in Tamaulipas in 2011 in connection with reporting on trafficking. Macias Castro was one of them and is the only one whose name is widely known. No one has been charged with her murder. There is no public record of a suspect, an arrest, or a prosecution in the 15 years since. The federal record on cases of this kind explains that outcome without requiring anyone to allege a cover-up. FEDL, the Federal Special Prosecutor's Office for Crimes Against Freedom of Expression, was created in 2010, a year before her death. In its first decade of operation, it opened hundreds of investigations into crimes against journalists and produced a number of convictions that can be counted on one hand. The reasons are structural. Federal jurisdiction has to be established before the office can take a case at all. Most cases stay with state prosecutors who lack capacity or independence, and in a state like Tamaulipas, the investigators who would have to work the case are operating inside the same compromised institutions that made the killing possible. Her own newspaper's silence deserves one further note. Primera Hora did not report the murder of its own news editor. Neither did any other Tamaulipas paper. That is not a failure of nerve by individuals so much as a description of what the arrangement in that state had achieved by 2011, which was a press that could not report on the killing of a journalist because reporting on killings was the thing that got journalists killed. Nuevo Laredo en Vivo continued to operate after her death. So did the practice of reporting cartel activity through social media across the northern border states, because the newspapers still were not doing it and people still needed to know which roads to avoid. What changed was the understanding of what the practice cost. Everyone participating in it after September 2011 was doing so with a clear picture of what had been arranged beside a monument in a town square, and with the knowledge that the people who had arranged it had gone to the trouble of including the keyboard. The keyboard is the detail that has kept the case in the record. Placing it beside her head was not a practical act, and it was not concealment. It was labeling. It identified what the killing was about to anyone who walked past, without requiring the note to be read, and it made the photograph that circulated afterward legible at a glance to people who could not read Spanish. Whoever arranged that scene understood that the audience was going to be looking at an image rather than reading a statement. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. A year later, and 500 miles south, a country doctor who had become a mayor was driving her daughter to school in Morelia. She had already survived 2 ambushes, buried the husband killed in the first one, and published photographs of her own scars rather than hide them. The men who pulled in front of her car that morning were the 3rd attempt. Section 4. Maria Santos Gorostieta Salazar. Maria Santos Gorostieta Salazar was born in 1976 in Tiquicheo, a municipality in the Tierra Caliente region of Michoacán. She trained as a physician at the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo and practiced medicine before entering politics. In 2008, she became mayor of the town she was born in, running under the banner of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, and she later moved to the Party of the Democratic Revolution. Sources differ on the exact span of her term. Most give it as 2008 to 2011. Some Mexican accounts give 2006 to 2012, and at least one describes her requesting leave near the end of the term to run for a legislative seat, failing to win it, and returning to the mayor's office. The variation is a function of Mexican municipal terms, party switches and leave arrangements, and it does not affect anything material about what happened to her. Tierra Caliente is the hot lowland country in the southwest of Michoacán, running toward the Guerrero state line, and it is one of the places in Mexico where the state has had the least practical presence for the longest time. Tiquicheo is a small municipality of scattered settlements in that country, with a population in the low tens of thousands spread across a wide area of hills and river valleys. It grows corn, sorghum, and cattle, and it sits on ground that has been used for marijuana and poppy cultivation for generations. The economics of that country matter for understanding what a mayor there controls and does not control. Tiquicheo has a small municipal budget, a police force that could be counted in dozens, and a road network that connects it to the rest of Michoacán through terrain where a vehicle can be stopped anywhere without a witness. A mayor in a place like that is not a figure with the power to confront an armed organization. A mayor is the person who signs municipal contracts, appoints the police chief, and decides which parts of the municipality the town government pays attention to. Those 3 functions are exactly what an organization needs, and they are available at a price that in a municipality that size is not large. The organization that controlled it when Gorostieta took office was La Familia Michoacana. La Familia had announced itself in September 2006 by rolling 5 severed heads onto the floor of a nightclub in Uruapan with a note claiming that it killed only those who deserved it, and it operated on a model that combined industrial-scale methamphetamine production with a presentation of itself as a protective force for the state. What made it different from the older trafficking organizations was the degree to which it embedded itself in municipal government. It did not simply pay off local officials. It selected them, funded campaigns, and treated town halls as administrative extensions of itself. The scale of that arrangement became publicly visible in May 2009, when federal agents detained a group of Michoacan mayors and state officials in a single sweep on accusations of protecting La Familia. The cases largely collapsed over the following year, and most of those detained were released without conviction, which produced the worst possible outcome for anyone in local office in that state. The federal government had demonstrated that it believed Michoacan municipal government was compromised, and had then demonstrated that it could not prove it. Gorostieta was the mayor of a Tierra Caliente municipality inside that arrangement, and she did not accept it. What specifically she refused has never been documented in a way that would satisfy a court, because there was never a proceeding in which it could be established. What is documented is that she began receiving threats in 2008, in her first year in office, and that the threats escalated into attempts. This is the point where the pattern that runs through several of these cases comes into focus. Criminal organizations in Mexico do not generally attempt to influence national politics because national politics does not deliver anything they need. They attempt to control municipal government because municipal government controls the police force that patrols the roads they use, the permits that govern the businesses they extort, and the public works contracts through which money can be moved. A mayor who cooperates is an asset worth more than a shipment. A mayor who does not is an obstacle sitting on top of all 3 of those functions at once, and the cost of removing one has historically been low. The first attempt came on October 15, 2009. She was traveling with her husband, Jose Sanchez Chavez, who had himself served as mayor of Tiquicheo before her. Michoacan state prosecutors stated at the time that the couple had stopped to use a public telephone when gunmen opened fire on them. Sanchez was killed. Gorostieta was hit in the chest and arms and survived. Prosecutors noted that Sanchez had already survived a separate ambush earlier that year on a rural road. She recovered and returned to the mayor's office. The second attack came in January 2010. She had taken part in a public event in Ciudad Altamirano, across the state line in Guerrero, and was traveling afterward when men with assault rifles opened fire on the vehicle. She was wounded again. 2 of her staff were wounded, and so was a female journalist traveling with the group. What she did after that second attack is the reason her name is known outside Mexico. Rather than withdraw from public view, she had photographs taken of her injuries and published them in the Tiquicheo municipal newsletter. The images showed her scarred torso. She wrote that she wanted people to see her wounded body because she was not ashamed of it, and she wrote that despite the risk to herself and to her family, what occupied her mind was her responsibility to the people of her municipality. She also stated flatly that she had no idea why she was a target, that she had no dealings of any kind involving money, family disputes, or crime, and that she had never quarreled with anyone in her town or any neighboring one. Reporting at the time noted that there were said to have been additional attempts on her that she never formally reported. That claim appears in Mexican coverage and has not been independently established. The photographs are the reason she stopped being a local story. Mexican municipal newsletters are dull documents, typically consisting of budget notices and announcements about road repairs, and they are read by almost nobody. Publishing images of her own scarred torso in one of them was a decision that only makes sense as an attempt to make herself impossible to disappear quietly. If enough people had seen what had already been done to her, the reasoning would run. A third attempt would carry a cost. That reasoning was sound, and it was also wrong, and the interval between the publication of those photographs and her abduction was close to 3 years. She completed her term in 2011 and remarried. She was no longer in office and no longer had whatever protection the office had carried, which in her case had amounted to state security measures applied intermittently after the second attack. On November 12, 2012, she was driving her daughter to school in Morelia, the state capital, roughly 100 miles from Tiquicheo. Vehicles pulled in front of her car. Witness accounts describe her pleading with the men to leave her daughter alone. The daughter was left. Gorostieta was taken. Her family reported her missing. On the morning of Thursday, November 15th, farm workers from San Juan Tararameo, in the municipality of Cuitzeo, found a body on a vacant property in an area known as El Chupadero as they walked to work. It remained unidentified in the state medical examiner's facility until the evening of Friday, November 16th, when relatives went to the Michoacan Attorney General's office. The state agency's report described stab wounds, injuries to the back of the head, and abrasions on the knees, indicating that she had been dragged. She was 36 years old. By the time she was killed, the organization that had first threatened her had reorganized. La Familia's leadership had been broken up by federal operations across 2010 and 2011, and the remnant had reconstituted under the name the Knights Templar, which adopted a written code of conduct for its members, presented itself in quasi-religious terms, and moved steadily away from drug production toward taxing the legal economy of the state instead. No public filing has ever attributed her killing to a named organization, and no arrest connected to it has been announced. That absence is the whole of the legal outcome. There is no prosecution, no charge, no named suspect, and no case that anyone has publicly reported working. A former mayor who had survived 2 documented armed attacks, whose husband had been killed in one of them, who had published photographs of her own gunshot wounds in a government newsletter, and who was abducted in front of her child in a state capital, produced a homicide file in Michoacan and nothing else. The absence has a structural explanation that applies across Michoacan in that period, rather than to her case specifically. State homicide investigation in Michoacan between 2010 and 2013 was being conducted by an apparatus that the federal government had itself accused of infiltration in a state where a criminal organization was collecting taxes from the legal economy and where investigators pursuing organized crime cases faced a documented risk of being killed for it. A former mayor found dead in a field in Cuitzeo generated a file in exactly the same system that had failed to resolve the 2 previous attacks on her while she was still in office and still under state protection. What did come out of it was international. Coverage of her death ran across Europe and North America, and she was described in that coverage as a symbol of civilian resistance in Michoacan. The following year, in 2013, farmers and business owners across several Michoacan municipalities armed themselves and formed self-defense groups, having concluded that the state was not going to protect them from extortion. Those groups drove Knights Templar operatives out of a number of towns before the federal government moved to absorb them into official structures, after which the boundary between a self-defense force, a municipal police unit, and a criminal organization became difficult to establish from outside. The daughter she was driving to school that morning was left at the roadside and survived. Nothing further about her has been published, and there is no reason it should have been. The point is only that the abduction was carried out by people who took the trouble to separate a child from a target in a city street in daylight, which indicates planning, a decision made in advance about what the operation was for, and a degree of confidence about not being interrupted. Gorostieta did not live to see that. She had been making the same argument alone, from a mayor's office in Tierra Caliente 4 years earlier, with no militia behind her and no weapon of her own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 2 years later, on the other side of the country, a doctor in Reynosa was running one of the most followed anonymous accounts on the northern border. She had 9,000 followers and a cat avatar and a pseudonym nobody had cracked. On the morning of October 16, 2014, her own account posted 2 photographs of her. Section 5. Maria del Rosario Fuentes Rubio. Maria del Rosario Fuentes Rubio was a physician in Reynosa, Tamaulipas. She worked at a clinic called Tierra Santa. Outside her practice, she ran a Twitter account under the handle Mute3, used the name Felina, and had a picture of Catwoman as her avatar. At the time of her death, the account had around 9,000 followers. Reynosa is a manufacturing city of several 100,000 people on the border across from Hidalgo, Texas. It has been controlled for decades by the Gulf Cartel, and by 2014, that control extended to the local institutions in a way that had been documented by press freedom organizations in some detail. The police were infiltrated. The local government was accommodating. The newsrooms had been censored to the point that major outlets were publishing nothing that had not been cleared in advance. The Gulf Cartel had also, by that point, been fighting Los Zetas across Tamaulipas for 4 years. The Zetas had originally been the Gulf Cartel's own armed wing, assembled in the late 1990s from deserting Mexican Army Special Forces soldiers, and the split between the 2 organizations in 2010 turned the northeast of the country into something close to open warfare. The practical effect for residents was a city where gun battles could break out on ordinary streets at any hour, with no warning and no news outlet willing to report where. What filled that gap was a network of anonymous accounts and citizen platforms, of which the largest in Tamaulipas was Valor por Tamaulipas. It had been founded in 2012 as a place where residents could file anonymous reports about violence and organized crime, and it grew quickly because the information it carried was immediately useful. A related project called Responsabilidad por Tamaulipas operated alongside it. The reports circulated under a hashtag, #ReynosaFollow, which was used whenever a shootout or a vehicle blockade was underway. Journalists in Texas monitored that hashtag as a news source because it was faster and often more accurate than anything coming out of the Mexican side. A broadcast reporter in Harlingen who tracked it told the committee to protect journalists that the reports were accurate and timely, that the participants policed the feed for false information, and that Fuentes Rubio was among the most diligent of the dozens of people using it. The organizations running Tamaulipas understood the value of shutting it down. Valor por Tamaulipas had faced sustained pressure since its founding, including a publicly circulated offer of 600,000 pesos, roughly $44,000 at the time, to anyone who could identify the people administering its Facebook page. The operational security problem inside a network like that is worth setting out, because it is the reason she died and the others did not. An anonymous account is only as anonymous as the least careful thing its operator ever does. Every fundraiser, every arrangement to get someone medical care, every message coordinating a blood donation creates a link between a pseudonym and a real person who was physically present somewhere at a known time. The people running Valor por Tamaulipas understood this and enforced it, which is why the platform survived. Fuentes Rubio was a doctor whose instinct when she encountered someone in difficulty was to help them, and helping people requires being reachable. Fuentes Rubio's activity went beyond posting warnings. She raised money, she organized blood donations, she helped people find affordable housing and free medical care. The founder of Valor por Tamaulipas later described her as someone who moved heaven and earth for anyone who needed it, and also described the argument the two of them had about it. Her colleagues warned her repeatedly that the community work was raising her public profile, and that a public profile was incompatible with the anonymity the rest of the operation depended on. She did not stop. The founder eventually removed her as an administrator after a final disagreement over helping someone who needed orthopedic shoes. She kept posting to the hashtag at high volume. Reynosa, in 2014, was also in the middle of an internal fracture that made it more dangerous than the simple description of Gulf cartel control suggests. After the capture and removal of successive leaders, the organization had split into factions that fought each other over the city itself, which meant that the identity of whoever controlled a given neighborhood could change without notice. For someone posting real-time reports about armed groups, that instability was the central hazard. Information that was safe to publish one month could be an offense against a different set of people the next, and there was no way to know which. On Wednesday, October 15, 2014, shortly before noon, she was abducted by armed men as she left the clinic where she worked. The Tamaulipas State Attorney General's office confirmed the abduction. Her family reported it. Early the following morning, messages began appearing on her own account. The first stated her real name. The next warned friends and family not to make the mistake she had made by using social media to report on organized crime, on the grounds that nothing came of it, and asked forgiveness. Another told her followers to shut down their accounts and not to risk their families the way she had risked hers. Another warned 3 named citizen journalists that the organizations were closer to them than they believed. The last thing posted from the account was not text. It was 2 photographs. In the first, a middle-aged woman stands with her hands folded in front of her, looking directly at the camera. In the second, the same woman is on a dirty floor with a gunshot wound to the face. The founder of Valor por Tamaulipas confirmed that the woman in both photographs was Felina. Twitter suspended the account shortly afterward. Her family filed a formal complaint and left the country on October 16th, the same day. That decision was made within hours by people who had just seen those images, and it was the correct decision. There was no protective mechanism available to them. Tamaulipas had no functioning witness protection they could realistically access. The federal protection mechanism for journalists and human rights defenders was overloaded and did not cover anonymous social media contributors in any practical sense. And the organization that had taken her had demonstrated in the most public way available that it knew who she was. What that sequence accomplished is worth stating precisely, because it was engineered. The killing itself would have been one more homicide in a city producing many of them. What was done instead was to take the account, use it to unmask her to her own followers, use it to have her apologize, use it to instruct thousands of people to stop what they were doing, use it to name 3 others by way of demonstrating how much was known, and only then to post the photographs. The audience for the murder was the 9,000 people already subscribed to her, and the message was delivered in her voice before it was delivered in her body. It worked, at least for a period. Citizen reporting accounts across Tamaulipas went quiet in the days that followed. People deleted accounts entirely, rather than simply pausing, on the assumption that whoever had taken her phone now had contact details, account information, and private messages for everyone she had ever communicated with. That assumption was reasonable and was never disproved. The effect on the wider network was measurable and lasting. The volume of reporting under the hashtag dropped sharply. Some accounts that had been active for years stopped permanently. Others resumed after a period, with far more caution and far less useful specificity, because the participants had absorbed a lesson about what a compromised phone can cost. The information environment in Reynosa never fully recovered, which means that for years afterward, residents of a city of several 100,000 people had no reliable way of finding out where the shooting was, and the newspapers still were not telling them. It is worth being clear about what the Mexican state did and did not confirm, because the gap is the case. The Tamaulipas Attorney General's office confirmed that a doctor was taken from outside a clinic in Reynosa at midday by armed men. It never officially confirmed her murder or a motive. a distinction that matters in Mexican procedure and which the Committee to Protect Journalists noted at the time. No body recovery was publicly announced, no arrest has been reported, no prosecution exists. Everything else in the public record of her death comes from her own Twitter account, operated by the people who took her, and from those who knew her and recognized her in the photographs. A woman was documented into and out of existence by the same account she had used to warn her city. Reporters Without Borders recorded the case and set it alongside the killing of Maria Elizabeth Macias Castro in Nuevo Laredo 3 years earlier. The two cases are the bookends of the same campaign, conducted by different organizations in different cities against the same target, which was the ability of ordinary residents to tell each other where the shooting was. There is a question that hangs over the case and cannot be answered from the public record, which is how her identity was established. The possibilities that circulated among her colleagues were a compromised device, an intercepted message, someone in the community who recognized a detail and sold it, or an abduction carried out for an entirely unrelated reason that only afterward revealed who she was. That last possibility was raised at the time and never ruled out. Reynosa, in 2014, produced abductions for ransom, for labor, and for no discernible reason at all, and a doctor leaving a clinic at midday was a target by several different logics. Valor por Tamaulipas continued to operate. The founder wrote afterward about being frightened of the pressure and of continuing to lose people from the state, some of whom he knew and some of whom he did not. The platform survived because it was decentralized and because the people running it had never been identified. Fuentes Rubio had been the exception, and the reason she was the exception was that she had kept helping people in ways that required being findable. One detail about the messages is worth isolating. Whoever wrote them wrote in her voice, in the first person, apologizing and instructing. That required someone to sit with a captured phone and compose text intended to be read as hers by people who knew how she wrote. It is a small thing next to what was done to her, and it is the part that indicates the killing was planned as a communication before it was carried out as a murder. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 15 months later, in a city an hour south of Mexico City, a woman was sworn in as mayor on New Year's Day and gave a speech about taking on organized crime directly. Gunmen entered her house the next morning while her family was inside. Investigators later put a price on the job, and it was smaller than anyone expected. Section 6. Gisela Raquel Mota Ocampo. Gisela Raquel Mota Ocampo was born on March 13, 1982, in Temixco, the city she would eventually govern for one day. She was a member of the Party of the Democratic Revolution and served in the Federal Chamber of Deputies from 2012 to 2015, representing the state of Morelos. In June 2015, she won the mayoral election in Temixco. She was the first woman elected to run the city. Temixco is a working city of around 100,000 people on the edge of Cuernavaca, in the state of Morelos, roughly 50 miles south of Mexico City. It is not a tourist town. What it has is position. The highway that runs from Mexico City south toward Acapulco passes through Cuernavaca and Temixco, and that highway is the principal route between the capital and the Pacific coast of Guerrero. Whatever moves along it passes through those municipalities. Morelos in 2016 was in the condition that follows the collapse of a dominant organization. The Beltran Leyva cartel had controlled drugs, kidnapping and extortion across the state until its leadership was broken up beginning in 2009. What replaced it was not another dominant organization, but a set of successor groups fighting each other, of which the two most significant in Morelos and neighboring Guerrero were Los Rojos and Guerreros Unidos. Those two names carry a great deal of weight in recent Mexican history. In September 2014, in Iguala, Guerrero, 43 students from a rural teachers' college disappeared after being detained by municipal police. Suspects later told investigators that Guerreros Unidos had mistaken the students for members of Los Rojos and had used local police officers under its control to seize them. The case became the defining scandal of the period, and its central finding was the one that mattered for every mayor in that region. Municipal police forces in Guerrero and Morelos were, in some municipalities, operationally available to criminal organizations. That finding produced a policy response. The Morelos state government under Governor Graco Ramirez was pushing a plan called Unified Command, under which all municipal police forces in the state would be folded into a single structure controlled at state level. The reasoning was straightforward. Town forces were small, poorly paid, and locally commanded, which made them purchasable. A unified force would be harder to buy piece by piece. The plan required each municipality to sign on individually, which is what made it dangerous to the people being asked. Signing on meant handing away control of the municipal police force. For a mayor actually trying to govern, that was a way of removing the single asset most likely to be captured by a criminal group. For a criminal group, it meant losing the low-paid, locally commanded officers who had been the cheapest and most reliable point of purchase in the entire structure. The policy therefore turned an administrative decision into a declaration, and every incoming mayor in Morelos in January 2016 was going to have to make it in public. Mota had campaigned on confronting organized crime, and she had made clear which way she intended to go. What a new Mexican mayor inherits on the first day is a municipal police force they did not recruit, a payroll they did not set, and a set of arrangements they were not told about. There is no transition apparatus that briefs an incoming municipal president on which of their officers is being paid by whom. Finding that out is a process that takes months and that announces itself to the people it concerns as it happens. A mayor who campaigns on confronting organized crime is therefore making a commitment that they will not be able to act on for some time, in a building full of people who already know what they are going to find. She was sworn in on Friday, January 1st, 2016. On the morning of Saturday, January 2nd, armed men entered her house. She was killed in front of members of her family. Paramedics reached the property and confirmed her death at 10 minutes to 8 in the morning. The attackers left. Her security detail and police pursued them, and the pursuit ended in a shootout. 2 of the presumed attackers were killed. 3 were arrested, described by the Associated Press as a 32-year-old woman, an 18-year-old man, and a minor. The Morelos state prosecutor, Javier Perez Duron, confirmed the arrests at a news conference. A statement from the prosecutor's office listed what was recovered from the vehicle the group had been traveling in, which included bulletproof vests, balaclavas, a 9mm pistol, an Uzi, and assorted ammunition. Governor Ramirez attributed the killing to Los Rojos, and he stated the motive publicly and without hedging. He said it was a message and a direct threat to the mayors who had just taken office across Morelos, intended to convince them not to accept the unified command arrangement so that criminal groups could continue to co-opt low-paid municipal officers. He ordered 3 days of official mourning, had flags on state buildings lowered, and announced security measures for every mayor in the state. The speed of the police response is unusual enough to note. The attackers were pursued within minutes, engaged, and partly captured, with the weapons still in the vehicle. That is a considerably better outcome than the response to almost every other killing in this video, and it happened because a sitting mayor with a security detail was attacked at her own home in a state capital region rather than because the underlying institutions were sound. It also produced something rare, which is a set of detainees who could be questioned immediately about who had sent them. 2 further details emerged from the interrogations and should be attributed carefully because they come through Mexican press reporting of what detainees told investigators rather than through a court record. The news outlet Sin Embargo reported that one of the 3 in custody said the team had been paid 500,000 pesos about $29,000 at the time, to carry out the killing. It was not made clear whether that sum was per person or for the group. The same reporting indicated that Mota's name was one of at least half a dozen on a list the team had been given. Those figures are the part of this case that tends to stay with people. A sitting mayor of a city of 100,000 people, elected on an anti-crime platform, was removed for a sum that would not buy a modest house in the country she governed, by a crew that had several other names still to work through. The killing did not stop the policy, which is the detail that undercuts the logic behind it. Unified command proceeded in Morelos, contested and incomplete, through the following years, and comparable consolidations of municipal policing went ahead in Chihuahua and Nuevo León on the same reasoning. What the killing did accomplish was narrower and probably sufficient from the point of view of the people who ordered it. Every mayor sworn in across Morelos that week received a demonstration of what the disagreement was going to cost, delivered inside a family home on the second morning of a 3-year term. The wider numbers around her death were compiled at the time by the Association of Local Authorities of Mexico, which put the figure at close to 100 local elected officials and more than 1,000 municipal workers attacked in Mexico over the previous decade, mostly by organized crime groups. Mota was not an outlier in that dataset. She was an unusually clear illustration of what the dataset was measuring, because the interval between her oath of office and her murder was short enough that nothing else could be blamed for it. The city she had been elected to run had also seen this before in a different form. In December 2014, a state lawmaker who was a candidate for mayor of Temixco from the same party was kidnapped there. He was rescued the following day, and authorities blamed Guerreros Unidos, the organization fighting Los Rojos across that region. Her family were in the house. That fact appears in the governor's account and in the coverage from the day, and it is generally passed over quickly. The people who came for her did not wait for her to leave for the municipal building, where there would have been a detail and a controlled entrance. They went into a residence on a Saturday morning at the start of a holiday weekend, which is the setting in which a person is least protected and most likely to be surrounded by the people closest to them. Temixco appointed a replacement, and the municipal government she had been elected to lead carried on without her from its third day onward. What has not been established publicly is the outcome of the prosecutions. 3 people were arrested at the scene of a pursuit within hours of the killing, with the weapons in the vehicle, and the governor named the organization on the record within 2 days. There is no publicly confirmed conviction of anyone for ordering the murder of Gisela Mota. The person who put her name on a list and the person who paid 500,000 pesos to have it acted on have never been publicly identified. There is a timing pattern here that recurs in the municipal cases in this video. Mota was killed on the second day of a term before she had exercised any power at all. Killings of this kind cluster at the point where power is about to transfer, which is when a criminal organization's arrangements are least settled, and when removing one person is most likely to change an outcome. Hundreds of people attended her funeral in Temixco on the Sunday, the day after she was killed, and 2 days after she had been sworn in. What happened to the policy afterward is its own comment on the killing. Ramirez extended unified command across the remaining municipalities in the state within days, bringing the total to 19 of 33, and including Cuernavaca, the state capital. The argument did not end there. It moved into a prolonged and public dispute between the governor and the incoming mayor of Cuernavaca over whether the capital's police would be handed over at all, with each side accusing the other of serving interests it would not name. Years after Mota was shot in her living room for accepting the arrangement, the people who succeeded her were still fighting about whether to accept it, in public, in the same buildings. Her last public post on Facebook was dated December 31st, the day before she took office. It shows her holding a newborn wrapped in blankets. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The next case is the only one in this video where the system worked. A reporter in Chihuahua City was shot 8 times outside her house with one of her children in the car. 3 years later, a man went to prison for 50 years for it, and the testimony at his trial named a former mayor. Section 7. Miroslava Breach-Velduchia. Miroslava Breach-Velduchia was born on August 7, 1962, in Chinipas de Almada, a municipality in the Sierra Tarahumara, the mountain country in the west of Chihuahua that runs down toward the Sonora and Sinaloa state lines. She went to grade school in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, and to secondary school in Navojoa, Sonora, and studied political science at the Autonomous University of Baja California Sur. She began working as a journalist in 1987 and was still working 30 years later. At the time of her death, she was the Chihuahua correspondent for La Jornada, one of the major national newspapers, and a contributor to Norte de Ciudad Juárez, where she also held an editorial post. In January 2017, she had started her own news agency, called MIR. She was a single mother. Accounts differ on whether she had 2 children or 3. The reason she was killed is unusually well documented for a case of this kind, and it comes back to the place she was born. The Sierra Tarahumara is remote, mountainous, sparsely policed, and productive. Marijuana and poppy have been grown in those mountains for generations, and the roads through them are few enough that controlling a municipality effectively means controlling a corridor. The organization that dominated the Chinipas area was a group known as Los Salazar, an armed structure aligned with the Sinaloa cartel that operated across the Chihuahua and Sonora border country. Chinipas is the kind of municipality where that arrangement is most complete. It has a few thousand residents, sits at the bottom of a canyon system reachable by a small number of roads, and is a long way from anywhere that a state prosecutor works. Journalism about a place like that is rare because there is no commercial reason to do it. There is no readership in Chinipas worth selling advertising against, and a national newspaper has no obvious reason to send anyone. Breach reported on it because she was from there, which meant she knew the family names, knew who had held which office, and could tell when something did not fit. Breach reported on that. Specifically, she reported on the point where the criminal structure met the political one, which in the Sierra Tarahumara meant candidates and office holders in small mountain municipalities who were connected to the organizations operating around them. That is a narrow subject with a small readership, and it is the most dangerous kind of reporting anyone can do in Mexico, because it threatens people who hold both a municipal budget and an armed group. The Federal Special Prosecutor's Office for Crimes Against Freedom of Expression, known as FIDEL, later stated the motive in those terms. She was targeted for her critical reporting on the links between local politicians and criminal groups in the Sierra Tarahumara. The specific reporting that appears to have triggered the killing concerned candidates. In the run-up to municipal elections in Chihuahua, Breach had published material identifying figures put forward for local office in the Sierra Tarahumara who were connected to criminal organizations operating there. That is the single most dangerous story available in Mexican journalism, because it does not embarrass a criminal organization in the abstract. It interferes directly with the mechanism by which the organization intends to control a municipality at the moment the mechanism is being operated. On the morning of March 23, 2017, shortly after 7 o'clock, she left her home in Chihuahua City and got into her car. One of her children was with her. An assailant shot her 8 times. The child was not hit. Breach died while being transported to hospital. She was 54. La Jornada reported that a note was left at the scene. It has been reported as carrying a short message about talkativeness, and the details circulates widely. Because the wording appears in secondary accounts, rather than in a released evidentiary record, it is treated here as reported, rather than established. A separate claim, appearing in Mexican coverage after the sentencing, holds that the killing was arranged as a birthday present for a figure in the organization. That claim comes through press reporting of trial material and has not been independently confirmed. What followed is the part that separates this case from the other 9 in this video, because an investigation actually ran and it produced a conviction. Juan Carlos Moreno Ochoa, known as El Larry and also as LWA, was arrested by federal police on December 25, 2017, in Echochoa, Sonora, roughly 9 months after the killing. Investigators established that he coordinated a Los Salazar cell operating across the mountain municipalities of Chinipas and Guasapares in Chihuahua and Alamos in Sonora. A second man, who had been connected to the case, had been murdered several days before Moreno's arrest. On April 27, 2018, a federal judge ordered Chihuahua state authorities to hand the case to Fidel, moving it from state to federal jurisdiction. That transfer is a significant procedural step and is a large part of why the case did not die. State prosecution of a killing ordered by an organization with local political connections in Chihuahua would have faced precisely the obstacles that buried most of the other cases here. A federal judge in Chihuahua convicted Moreno on March 18, 2020, of participation in the murder as its intellectual author, meaning the person who ordered it rather than the person who fired. Sentencing was delayed by the pandemic. On August 21, 2020, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The Federal Attorney General's office stated that this was the highest sentence handed down to that point for a crime committed against freedom of expression in Mexico, and described it as a precedent. The court found aggravating circumstances of premeditation, treachery, and advantage, and took into account that intimidating messages had been directed at Breach beforehand. Fidel identified Crispin Salazar Zamorano, described as the head of the Salazar organization, as having masterminded the killing. A second suspect connected to the operation, identified in federal statements only by a first name and elsewhere by a surname, remained at large. In December 2020, the case reached the political side. Hugo Ahmed Schultz Alcaraz, the former mayor of Chinipas and a member of the National Action Party, was arrested. A Chihuahua court found sufficient grounds to establish his probable responsibility for complicity, on the basis that he had sought and supplied information to the criminal group that ordered and carried out the murder. Testimony during Moreno's trial had described politicians recording telephone conversations with Breach and handing the recordings over. The reporting on the arrest indicated that Schultz, with support from party figures in Chihuahua, had pressed Breach to reveal her sources for a story identifying members of criminal organizations in local politics. That sequence is the reason this case is cited. It established, through a court rather than through inference, the shape that most people had assumed and almost nobody had ever proved. A reporter asked questions about a mountain municipality. A local politician wanted to know where her information was coming from. When she would not say, the question and the recordings went to the armed organization operating in that municipality, and the organization's local cell leader arranged the killing. Even so, the outcome should not be overstated. The man who ordered it is serving 50 years. The organization's head, named by federal prosecutors as the mastermind, was not brought to trial for it. One participant was killed before he could be arrested. Another remained a fugitive years later. Press freedom organizations, including the Committee to Protect Journalists, welcomed the sentence while pressing Mexican authorities to pursue everyone else involved. It is worth being precise about what a 50-year sentence for an intellectual author actually represents in this context. Mexican prosecutions of killings connected to organized crime, where they happen at all, tend to reach the person who pulled the trigger and stop there. Establishing that a specific individual ordered a killing requires telephone records, cooperating witnesses, and a prosecutor willing to build a case against someone who commands an armed group in the territory where the evidence has to be gathered. Fidel managed that here, 3 years after the fact, and Mexican federal prosecutors described the result as a precedent precisely because there was so little to compare it to. The wider context makes the case rarer than it looks. Breach was one of a substantial number of journalists killed in Mexico in 2017, and more than 100 have been killed in the country since 2000. The proportion of those killings that have produced a conviction is small enough that a single 50-year sentence was treated as a national development. The fate of her employers is part of the story. Norte de Ciudad Juárez, where she held an editorial post, shut down within weeks of her death, its publisher stating openly that the conditions to keep operating no longer existed. That closure removed one of the few outlets in Chihuahua that had been covering the subject she died for. The practical result of a killing like hers is not only the loss of the reporter, it is the loss of the institution that carried her work, and of whatever future reporting would have come out of it. Her reporting on the Sierra Tarahumara continued after her, in the sense that other journalists took up the subject, and that her own organization's material remained on the record. The child in the car has never been publicly identified, which is appropriate. What the presence of a child establishes is that the person who fired was not deterred by a witness of any kind, including one whose account would eventually be available to investigators. That is a calculation about consequences, and in Chihuahua, in March 2017, it was a reasonable one to make. It turned out, unusually, to be wrong. Her killing is also one of the few in this video where the victim's family had legal representation throughout, provided by a Mexico City non-profit called Propuesta Cívica, which represented them across the trial and which issued the statements confirming the sentence. That representation is not incidental to the outcome. Families without it do not generally see cases move. The other thing the breach case established is that a conviction requires someone outside the local system to want one. The transfer to federal jurisdiction, the involvement of a national newspaper whose correspondent had been killed, the legal representation provided to the family, and the sustained attention of international press freedom organizations were all external pressures on a case that a Chihuahua state prosecutor's office would otherwise have been left to handle alone. Remove any one of those, and the outcome is likely the same as the outcome in the other 9 cases here. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 7 weeks later, and 600 miles east, a woman in San Fernando was making her way to her front door on crutches. She had spent 2 years tracking down the men who took her daughter, using disguises and a false identity card, and she had put several of them in prison herself. In March, a tunnel had emptied that prison of 29 men. Section 8. Miriam Elizabeth Rodriguez Martinez. Miriam Elizabeth Rodriguez Martinez was born on February 5, 1960, in San Fernando, Tamaulipas. She ran a small business. She had children. Until her daughter was taken, there was nothing about her life that would have suggested what she became. San Fernando is a municipality in the north of Tamaulipas, on the highway that runs from the interior of Mexico toward the border crossings at Matamoros and Reynosa. It is agricultural country, flat and thinly populated, and it holds a specific place in the record of the Mexican drug war. In August 2010, the bodies of 72 migrants from Central and South America were found on a ranch there, killed by Los Zetas. In April 2011, the discovery of mass graves in the same municipality eventually produced close to 200 bodies, many of them passengers pulled off intercity buses. San Fernando is not a place where disappearance was unusual. It is one of the places that taught the country what mass disappearance looked like. 2 things about that history bear directly on what happened to her family. The first is that the organization responsible for the San Fernando killings, Los Zetas, was not primarily funding itself through drug trafficking in that municipality. It was funding itself through extortion, kidnapping, and the systematic robbery of people passing through, which is why the victims were migrants and bus passengers rather than rivals. The second is that a great deal of the local apparatus was involved. Municipal police officers in San Fernando were among those later detained in connection with the mass graves. Reporting a kidnapping to the police in that town was, for a period, an act with an uncertain audience. Rodriguez's daughter, Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodriguez, was abducted from a vehicle in San Fernando by armed men who forced their way in from 2 trucks that pulled alongside her. The published record contains a real conflict about when that happened and how old Karen was, and it should be stated rather than smoothed over. Some accounts, including the Wikipedia entry and a solidarity statement issued after Rodriguez's death, give the abduction as 2012 and Karen's age as 14. Other accounts, including detailed English language reporting, give the date as January 23, 2014, and her age as 20. Mexican prosecutors referred to the kidnapping and killing of Karen in 2014. The discrepancy has never been resolved in any single authoritative source, and both versions remain in circulation. What is consistent across every account is what her mother did next. The Zetas had taken Karen. The authorities did not pursue it. Rodriguez searched for 2 years, and she did the searching herself, in a manner that has no real parallel in the record of these cases. She used disguises. She obtained a false identification card. She conducted surveillance across multiple states, following people and establishing where they were. She built a picture of who had been involved in the extortion, abduction, and killing of her daughter, and she took that information to the authorities in a form specific enough that they had to act on it. The method deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it was not luck. What she did was ordinary investigative work carried out by someone with no training and no authority. She identified people connected to the group, established their routines, and put herself in positions where she could observe them without being recognized, which is what the disguises and the false identification were for. She did it across state lines and over a period of years, and she assembled it into something specific enough that prosecutors could not file it away. The reason so few families achieve this is not that they lack the will, it is that it requires time, money, mobility, and a tolerance for personal risk that almost nobody has. The arrests followed. Accounts of the number vary, with some sources putting it at 5 cartel operatives and others describing a longer sequence over time. Her work also led her to Karen's remains, which were recovered from an unmarked grave. She did not stop there either. She founded and led a collective of families in San Fernando searching for disappeared relatives, an organization that grew to represent something in the order of 600 families. She became a public critic of the Mexican state's handling of disappearances, describing Tamaulipas in terms that state officials did not appreciate. And in April 2017, she publicly challenged the federal victims law on the grounds that it sidelined independent search collectives like hers. There is a moment from that period that says most of what needs saying about her. When one of the men connected to her daughter's case was arrested inside a chapel, and members of the congregation objected to the manner of it, she was asked whether she had any sympathy for him. She asked where his compassion had been when they killed her daughter. Her public criticism escalated the exposure considerably. She did not confine herself to her own case. She attacked the state's handling of remains, pressed for the excavation of graves that authorities had left alone, and described Tamaulipas in terms that made state officials her adversaries, as well as the organization that had killed Karen. That combination is the position almost every woman in this video ended up occupying, in which the people who would have to provide protection are also the people being publicly accused of failure. On March 22, 2017, 29 prisoners escaped from the penitentiary in Ciudad Victoria, the Tamaulipas state capital, through a tunnel. Among them were men implicated in Karen's kidnapping and murder. Rodriguez understood immediately what that meant. She reported threats. She asked for police protection, Local police agreed to send patrols past her house. That was the extent of what was provided. On May 10, 2017, Mexican Mother's Day, she was killed at her home in San Fernando. She was 57. The accounts of the killing itself differ in their details. The version that appears most often in English describes her approaching her front door on crutches, having broken her foot chasing a suspect, when a white Nissan driven by escaped inmates pulled up and the occupants shot her about a dozen times before driving off. Her husband found her in the driveway with her hand inside her purse, where she kept a pistol. Another account, issued in a solidarity letter after her death, describes armed men breaking into the house, shooting her 12 times, and her dying on the way to hospital, with other family members surviving the attack. The number of shots is consistent across versions. The location and the sequence are not. The escape itself has never been satisfactorily explained. 29 men left a state penitentiary in the Tamaulipas capital through a tunnel, which is not an undertaking that can be concealed from staff in a functioning institution. Tunnel escapes on that scale have occurred repeatedly in Mexican prisons and have consistently been followed by findings of official participation. Rodriguez did not need to be told any of this. She knew which men had gone, and she knew what they would want, and the 7 weeks that followed were spent asking for a response proportionate to that. The response from the state was faster than in any other case in this video, and it was still not much. Tamaulipas Attorney General Irving Barrios announced within weeks that 2 men had been arrested and charged, and stated plainly that the strongest line of investigation was that the killing was an act of revenge for the work Rodriguez had carried out, which had led to the detention of several people in connection with her daughter's kidnapping. He said the men knew at least one other suspect who had been jailed in Karen's case. 4 other suspects were implicated. The state governor said publicly that the government of Tamaulipas would not allow her death to become another statistic. The European Union issued a statement through its spokesperson describing the killing on Mother's Day as particularly shocking and setting it alongside the murders of 2 indigenous rights activists and 5 journalists in Mexico in the first months of that year alone. The thing that makes her case difficult is that she succeeded. Almost every other woman in this video was killed for attempting something. Rodriguez was killed for having accomplished it. She had located the men responsible for her daughter's death, assembled evidence against them, and put them in a Mexican prison, which is an outcome that the entire Mexican justice apparatus fails to produce in the overwhelming majority of homicides. The prison then failed to hold them, and they came back for her, and the protection she had requested in the 7 weeks between the escape and her death consisted of patrol cars driving past. The Tamaulipas prosecution that followed her death should be given its due and also kept in proportion. 2 arrests within weeks, with charges filed and a motive stated publicly by the state attorney general, is a materially better response than 8 of the 10 cases in this video received. It also came after her death rather than before it, in answer to a threat she had identified precisely, named in advance, and asked for help with for 7 weeks. The state was capable of moving quickly. It moved quickly once she was dead. The collective she founded continued after her. So did the wider movement of search collectives across Mexico, which by then numbered in the dozens, and which has since recovered thousands of bodies from clandestine graves that state prosecutors had not looked for. Those groups are made up overwhelmingly of women, most of them mothers, most of them without training or resources, digging with hand tools in fields. What she demonstrated before them was the thing those collectives have been proving ever since. The cases are not unsolvable. The men who took Karen Salinas were locatable by a woman in her 50s with a false identity card and enough patience, working alone, against an organization that had murdered hundreds of people in the same municipality. Every element of what she did was available to the Tamaulipas authorities in greater quantity and with legal powers attached. It was simply not done. Every woman digging in a field in Mexico today is working with the knowledge Miriam Rodriguez ended up with, which is that the search is theirs to carry out and that finishing it can be more dangerous than starting it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 4 years later, in a textile town in Guanajuato, a 61-year-old woman posted a video inviting her neighbors to come and hear her ideas. She said she would be waiting for them. About an hour after she posted it, men who had mixed into the crowd in front of her opened fire while she was still holding the microphone. Section 9. Alma Rosa Barragan, Santiago. Alma Rosa Barragan Santiago was 61 years old and was running for mayor of Moroleón, a municipality in the far south of Guanajuato, on the border with Michoacán. She was the candidate of Movimiento Ciudadano, the Citizens Movement Party. The election was set for June 6, 2021. Moroleón is a textile town. It and the adjoining municipality of Uriangato form a manufacturing and retail cluster that has produced and sold clothing for generations, drawing buyers from across central Mexico. It is not a place with a national profile, and it is not on any tourist route. It has around 50,000 residents, and it sits at the point where Guanajuato meets Michoacán. That location is the problem. Guanajuato by 2021 was recording more homicides than any other state in Mexico, and the reason was a conflict that had almost nothing to do with the drug routes people usually associate with cartel violence. The Santa Rosa de Lima cartel had emerged in Guanajuato around a business built on stealing fuel from the pipelines crossing the state, an activity known in Mexico as huachicol. When the Jalisco New Generation cartel moved to take that business, the resulting war ran municipality by municipality across the Bajío, the agricultural and industrial belt of central Mexico that covers Guanajuato and the northern edge of Michoacán. The fuel theft business is worth explaining because it drove everything that followed. Mexico's state oil company operates a network of pipelines carrying refined product across the center of the country, and Guanajuato sits on several of them. Stealing from a pipeline requires tapping it, which requires knowing where it runs, having ground access to it, and being confident that nobody will interfere for the hours the work takes. It also requires trucks, buyers, and somewhere to store the product. All of that is local. None of it can be moved somewhere safer if conditions deteriorate, which is why the fight over it became a fight over specific towns rather than over routes. What that kind of conflict produces is different from a border war. A fight over a smuggling corridor is a fight about a road. A fight over fuel theft, extortion of local businesses, and retail drug sales is a fight about a town, and winning it requires controlling the town's institutions. That is the reason the 2021 election season in Mexico became the most violent in the country's history to that point. The scale of it was tracked by a risk analysis firm called Etellect, which specializes in political violence during Mexican electoral processes. By the night Barragan was killed, the firm's count of politicians killed during that electoral season stood at 88. 34 of them were candidates in the coming June election. The result across Guanajuato was a homicide rate that placed the state at the top of the national table for several consecutive years, generated by a conflict most people outside Mexico had never heard of and that had very little to do with cocaine. Ordinary businesses in towns across the Bajío paid extortion on a schedule. Municipal police forces were infiltrated, purged and infiltrated again. Candidates for local office in that environment were not being asked to take a position on organized crime in the abstract. They were being assessed, in advance, on whether they would be a problem. The textile trade is what makes a town hall in Moroleón worth having. The clothing produced there is sold wholesale out of hundreds of small workshops and storefronts, in a market that runs largely on cash and that draws buyers traveling in from other states. An economy shaped like that is close to ideal for extortion. There are many small operators rather than a few large ones, none of them individually able to resist, all of them dependent on the same streets and the same market days, and all of them handling money that leaves no record. Collecting from them requires knowing who trades where and when, which is information a municipal government holds, and it requires a police force that does not interfere. Moroleon had already produced one of the attacks. 8 days before Barragan's campaign event, Juan Guzman Ramirez, a candidate for local deputy running for an alliance of the Institutional Revolutionary Party and the Party of the Democratic Revolution, was shot in Moroleon. He survived. The attack on him happened about 4 kilometers from where Barragan would be killed. Her own party had lost 2 candidates in the previous 2 weeks. On May 13th, Abel Murrieta Gutierrez, a former Attorney General of Sonora who was running for mayor of Cajeme, was shot dead while handing out flyers on a street. 2 more members of the party had been found murdered over the weekend before Barragan's death, in Querétaro and in Sonora. None of that stopped the campaign, because stopping the campaign was not a realistic option for a candidate who intended to be on the ballot in 12 days. That she kept campaigning in those conditions is the fact worth holding on to. She was 61 years old, running in a municipality of 50,000 people for an office with a modest salary, in a state where a candidate had been shot 4 kilometers away 8 days earlier, and where her own party had buried 2 people in a fortnight. Every candidate in Guanajuato that spring was making the same calculation, and most of them made it the same way she did, which was to carry on and hope that the organization making the decisions had no particular interest in them. On the afternoon of Tuesday, May 25, 2021, Barragan posted a video to her Facebook page. She was in the neighborhood of La Manguita, on the outskirts of Moroleon, on a street named for Pedro Guzman. She invited residents of La Manguita and of the neighboring areas of Pico de Pájaro and El Ombligo to come and join her and hear her proposals. She said they should come and spend a moment together, that together they do better, and that she would be waiting there. About an hour later, at somewhere between 10 minutes to 6 and 6 o'clock in the evening, she was standing in the open with a microphone in her hand, presenting those proposals to a small crowd. Video of what followed was later broadcast in Mexico. Gunmen who had mixed into the crowd opened fire on her and on members of her team. She died at the scene. 2 other people were wounded and taken to hospital. The Guanajuato Attorney General's office condemned the attack the same evening and assigned a team from the State Criminal Investigation Agency to work alongside the homicide unit. The state government secretary posted a condemnation within minutes. The party's national coordinator called for a thorough investigation and punishment of those responsible. Her party published a posthumous message on her behalf saying that she was not afraid. The main line of investigation reported by the Guanajuato prosecutor's office pointed to the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador stated the following week that there were people in custody in connection with the case. The most useful account of the motive came from her own family. One of her children said publicly that they believed the men who shot her did not even know who she was, and that they were following orders from an organized crime group operating in that area. That statement is worth taking seriously because it describes how this category of killing actually works. The shooters in a municipal political assassination in the Bajío are generally local, young, cheaply hired, and given a description and a location rather than a reason. The decision is made by someone who has calculated that a particular candidate is less useful than the alternative, or that an example needs to be set for everyone else on the ballot. The people who carry it out do not need to be told any of that, and mostly are not. The specific reason Alma Rosa Barragan was selected has never been established publicly. No motive has been stated by the Guanajuato prosecutor's office beyond the attribution to a criminal group. No account has been published of what she had said, promised, or refused that put her on a list. She had not been in office. She was a candidate in a municipality of 50,000 people, 12 days from an election she might not have won. The video is also part of why the case registered nationally. Political killings in Mexico are usually reported rather than seen. This one was recorded, broadcast, and widely circulated. And what it shows is not an ambush on a road or a shooting outside a house at night. It shows a woman speaking to a few dozen neighbors on a residential street in the early evening, and men standing among those neighbors, listening until they were not. The absence of any separation between the crowd and the shooters is the detail people remembered. What is established is the pattern she died inside. Mexican electoral violence concentrates almost entirely at the municipal level, and the reason is that municipal government is where the assets are that criminal organizations actually need. A mayor controls the municipal police force, the permits, the public works contracts, and the local budget. A state governor or a federal deputy controls none of those things in a way that affects a particular town. Organizations, therefore, do not generally attempt to influence national politics. They attempt to select mayors, and in the weeks before an election, the cheapest way to influence a municipal outcome is to remove a name from the ballot. Elect's figures for that season were eventually revised upward as the count continued through election day, and the firms reporting on the cycle described a pattern in which the great majority of those attacked held or sought municipal positions, and in which attacks clustered in states with active territorial conflicts. Guanajuato was among the worst of them. The numbers were public throughout the campaign, which means every candidate on a ballot in that state that spring was operating with a reasonably accurate picture of the risk and choosing to run anyway. Moroleon held its election on June 6, 2021, 12 days after she was killed. Her children were left with the two things families in these cases are usually left with, which are a recording of the death and a set of official condemnations issued within hours. Both arrived quickly. Neither has been followed by an account of who decided she should not be on the ballot, and there is no indication that such an account is coming. There is no publicly confirmed conviction of anyone for the murder of Alma Rosa Barragan Santiago. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The last case is the most recent, and the woman in it saw it coming clearly enough to say so on the record. Hours before she was killed, she stood at a press conference, presented her plan for public safety, and said she had asked the authorities for protection and was still waiting to hear back. It was the first day of her campaign. Section 10. Bertha Gisela Gaitan Gutierrez. Bertha Gisela Gaitan Gutierrez was born on April 6, 1986, in Celaya, Guanajuato. She trained as a lawyer at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She was a member of Morena, the party of the sitting president, and in 2024, she was its candidate for municipal president of the city she had been born in. She was killed 5 days before her 38th birthday. Some reporting gives her age as 37 and some as 38, which is a function of where the birthday fell. Celaya is a city of more than 500,000 people in southeastern Guanajuato. It is an industrial center, a rail and highway junction, and by the time of the 2024 election, it was ranked among the most violent cities in the world by homicide rate. Guanajuato as a state had for several consecutive years recorded more homicides than any other in Mexico. 60 police officers were killed in the state in 2023 alone. The reason is the same conflict described in the previous case, running 4 years further on. The war between the Santa Rosa de Lima organization and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel had by 2024 been fought across Guanajuato for the better part of a decade, and Celaya sat at the center of it. Fuel theft, extortion of local businesses, retail drug sales, and control of municipal institutions were all in play, and municipal government was the prize rather than a bystander. Celaya's position in that conflict is geographic. It sits at the junction of the highways connecting Mexico City to Guadalajara and to the northern border, and it is a rail hub and an industrial center with a substantial automotive manufacturing sector. Everything that makes it economically valuable also makes it valuable to an organization running fuel theft, extortion, and retail drug sales, because the same features that attract factories and freight also produce a large population of businesses that can be taxed and a large volume of traffic that can be interfered with. The 2024 general election was the largest in Mexican history. It would decide the presidency and more than 20,000 offices at federal, state, and municipal level. It was also, by a substantial margin, the most violent. Counts vary depending on what is being measured. The Associated Press estimated at least 15 candidates killed between January and the start of April. The Guardian reported at least 22 mayoral candidates murdered since September 2023. A tally compiled by the Mexican outlet Merca 2.0, covering December 2023 through June 2024, counted more than 260 political figures, candidates, officials, and family members killed across the cycle. The figures matter less as a total than as an indication of where the violence lands. Overwhelmingly, the candidates killed in Mexican elections are running for municipal office in medium-sized and small municipalities. They are not senators, they are not governors. They are people running to be mayor of a town, in states where the mayor's office controls a police force, a permit system, and a budget, and where an organization with a preference about the outcome has a cheap and reliable way of expressing it. Gaetan understood the position she was in, and she said so publicly on the day she died. Hours before the attack, she held a press conference in Celaya, at which she presented her proposals on corruption and public safety. Asked about her own security, she said that the citizens were with her and looking after her, but that of course there would be security protocols, and that she was waiting to see whether the authorities would give her an answer that day about the protection she had requested. They had not. She campaigned anyway. The protection request she described is the part of this case that generated the most argument afterward, and the mechanics of it are worth setting out. Mexican electoral authorities do arrange security for candidates, but the arrangements are split. The National Electoral Institute handles candidates for federal office. Candidates for state and municipal office depend on state-level electoral authorities and state governments, which vary enormously in what they actually provide. A candidate for mayor of a violent city in the most violent state in the country therefore sits in the part of the system with the least capacity and has to ask and then wait. On the evening of Monday, April 1, 2024, the first day of the campaign period, she was in San Miguel Octopan, a community about 10 kilometers northeast of central Celaya. She had visited the city's central market earlier in the day. She was walking through the streets greeting residents, surrounded by supporters carrying maroon party flags and chanting the party's name. Video recorded by people present and later posted online captures the chanting and then the gunfire and then a scream some distance off. Shortly before 6 o'clock in the evening, gunmen opened fire on the group in the middle of the street. Gaetan was killed. The Guanajuato State Prosecutor's Office described her death as an assassination. 3 other people were injured. Among them was Adrian Guerrero, a Morena candidate for a seat on the Celaya City Council. What happened to the public record of Guerrero over the following 24 hours is worth including, because it illustrates the conditions this case was investigated in. On the Tuesday, authorities stated that he had died of his injuries, and that statement was carried internationally. Later the same day, the Federal Security Ministry issued a correction saying that he was in fact missing rather than deceased, and specifically retracting the earlier report of his death. A day after a candidate was assassinated in front of a crowd, in a case being handled at federal and state levels simultaneously, the Mexican government could not establish whether a second candidate wounded in the same attack was alive, dead, or missing. The protection question became a political argument almost immediately. The Federal Security Minister, Rosa Isela Rodriguez, said that the National Electoral Institute arranged protection for candidates running for federal office and indicated that electoral authorities in Guanajuato had not organized equivalent protection For candidates running for local office, Gaetan had been running for local office. The candidates most likely to be killed in a Mexican election are the ones the protective system was not built to cover. And this is because the organizations doing the killing are interested in town halls rather than in the national legislature. President López Obrador condemned the killing the following day, saying that events of that kind were deeply regrettable because the people affected were fighting to assert democracy, out in the streets, showing their faces and fighting on behalf of others. Morena described it as the cowardly murder of a colleague and demanded that the Guanajuato prosecutor's office investigate, arrest those responsible, and deliver justice. The party's candidate for governor of Guanajuato announced the suspension of campaign activities. It is also worth noting what the correction episode says about the information environment. The confusion over whether Adrián Guerrero was dead, alive, or missing was not the product of a remote incident in inaccessible terrain. It happened in a city of 500,000 people, in a case under national scrutiny, involving a candidate from the governing party, with federal security officials directly engaged. If that could not be established within a day, the reliability of everything else being reported in the first hours after an attack of this kind should be assumed to be low. This case did produce arrests, and relatively quickly. In May 2024, the Guanajuato Attorney General's office announced that it had broken up a criminal cell linked to the murder and to a number of other crimes in the Laja Bajío region of the state. 7 people were detained, 4 men, 1 woman, and 2 adolescents. The office stated that the leader of the cell was among them. It did not name the organization the cell belonged to. The description of the investigative work behind those arrests is more detailed than in almost any other case in this video. The State Criminal Investigation Agency ran a series of operations to locate the suspects, and the prosecutor's office cited ballistics analysis, interviews, and hundreds of hours of analysis of telephone records. Police identified and seized the motorcycles and the vehicle used in the killing. That is a real investigation, conducted competently, in a state whose prosecutors are working under conditions that make competence expensive. What has not been publicly established is what happened afterward. There is no publicly confirmed conviction of anyone for the murder of Gisela Gaetan. Mexico's impunity rate for homicide has been measured for years at above 90%, which means the overwhelming majority of killings in the country produce no conviction of anyone, and arrests announced at a press conference are not the same thing as a verdict. The interval between the announcement of those arrests and any subsequent public development is the part that mirrors the rest of this video. Guanajuato prosecutors described a competent operation, seized the vehicles, and detained a cell leader. What has not followed publicly is a trial, a verdict, or an explanation of who instructed the cell and why. Arrests are the stage of a Mexican homicide case that generates a press conference. The stages after it generate very little, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, they do not arrive at all. There is also no public statement of why she in particular was chosen. Like Barragán 3 years earlier, and in the neighboring part of the same state, Gaetan had not held office. She had been a candidate for a single day. Whatever calculation placed her name in front of a crew with motorcycles has never been explained by anyone in a position to explain it. Her family and her party were left pressing a prosecutor's office that had already produced its result, which was 7 people in custody and no explanation. In the ordinary course of a Mexican municipal case, that is where the public record ends and the file moves into a backlog measured in years. The election went ahead on June 2nd, 2024. Celaya elected a mayor. Mexico elected its first woman president. The campaign that had killed more candidates than any in the country's history concluded on schedule, and the counting of the dead moved from news coverage into the datasets kept by consultancies that specialize in the subject. One last point about Celaya belongs here. Gaitan was a lawyer from the city she was running to govern, killed in a community 10 kilometers from its center, on a street where the people around her were neighbors. Every case in this video has that quality somewhere in it. These were not outsiders who arrived with a program. They were local women who held local positions in the places they came from. And what killed them was the decision to hold those positions on their own terms. 10 women appear in this video. One of them was a police chief, one was a doctor, one was a nurse, one was a physician turned mayor, 2 were journalists, 2 were mothers who did the investigative work themselves, and 2 were candidates for municipal office. None of them belonged to a cartel. None of them informed on one from the inside. Every one of them stood in front of an organization that expected the space they were occupying to be available and refused to move out of it. 2 of the 10 cases produced a conviction. In the other 8, nobody has been convicted of anything. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.